Hello there. So we're going to do a little heart dissection here. Now, the first step is to make sure that you've got the heart in the right orientation. So this is a heart as we're looking at it at the front, and then we've got the left-hand side and the right-hand side. This bit sort of goes from the top left of the heart down to the bottom right. So your heart sort of sits like this within your body. This line down here is the septum. And then we can see here, these little vessels going down there are the coronary arteries. Okay, so let's try and work out what each part is before we cut open into this. So as I say here, we've got the septum. So this is the left-hand side of the heart. This is the right-hand side. Now, when you get your heart, you can give it a little squeeze and you'll be able to really feel the difference. So if you get lost anywhere, you can give this side a squeeze here and you'll notice that it is much thicker than this side. So the left-hand side is much thicker than the right-hand side. Now, if we just rotate it round, this is the back of the heart, and looking at it this way, this is pretty much taking it back to normal. So now this is the left-hand side, and this is the right-hand side. So here's our right ventricle, this is our left ventricle, and then this bit up here is the left atrium, and this little tiny one here is our right atrium. So if we look at it in sort of this sort of way, there's our right atrium. Our right ventricle is all this region. This is our left ventricle, and this is our left atrium. So right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Now, the next wee bit is looking up at the top here to see these blood vessels. Now, if you look, we can actually see 4 blood vessels. There's one, there's the second one, so 1, 2, and those are 2 arteries, and then we've got a big vein here, and then we've got another vein just over this side. So there's our 4 vessels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, to identify these, the easiest thing to do is actually poke your fingers in and see where they go. So this one here, if I poke my finger right into it and then squeeze down to see where it goes, I can feel that it's coming out of the left ventricle. So that means that this is the aorta, and you can sort of see that because it's a big artery and it has very stretchy walls. This other artery then just beside it must be the pulmonary artery. So if I poke this into it, I can see that that's coming out of the right ventricle. So this is the pulmonary artery, and this here is the aorta. Now the other 2 are much more straightforward. Here we've got the right atrium, and then that means that that's the vena cava leading into the right atrium. And then here we've got the left atrium, so this must be a pulmonary vein going into the left atrium, which then goes into the left ventricle. We've got the vena cava going in to the right atrium. Blood goes from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then it gets pumped upwards and outwards through the pulmonary artery. It goes to the lungs, the blood picks up the oxygen, and it comes back into the pulmonary vein. It goes into the left atrium, and then it goes into the left ventricle, and then it gets pumped up and out into the aorta to the rest of the body. Now, the next step is then making a little incision. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut the right hand side, so straight down through the right atrium into the right ventricle. And then at this side, we're going to cut straight down the left atrium through the left ventricle. So let's go. Now, here we've got each wall of the ventricles cut open, but there's so much blood in this that I'm going to go out and give it a little rinse. I'll be back in a jiffy. So here we are again. Now, up here, we've got the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then we've got the left atrium, which feeds into the left ventricle. Now, the different structures that we can see inside. Firstly, if we look between the right atrium and the right ventricle, we have got an AV valve. There's the big man.
Yeah!
Right, so here we've got the right ventricle, the septum, and then the left ventricle. So if we open up the right hand side of the heart, what we can see going from the right atrium down into the right ventricle is this little valve, and this is an AV valve. If you look at it there, you can see how when the ventricles were contracting, it'll open up like that, and it'll stop the blood flowing backwards into the atria. Now, if you look really closely, we can see a few other things. So there's the valve. Those little strings there are the chordae tendineae. And we can see there that the chordae tendineae are attached to the papillary muscle. So there's the valves, the chordae tendineae, and the papillary muscle. Now, how these work is when the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles also contract, and they pull the chordae tendineae taut, and that opens up the valve like that, and it stops blood flowing backwards up into the atria. So here we've got right atrium, this region in here, the AV valve, the chordae tendineae, and the papillary muscle. So there's some papillary muscle there and there. Now, that then, when the ventricles contract, the blood goes up through there and out through the pulmonary artery, which is out there. Ta-da! Hello. So, there we go. We've got right atrium, tricuspid valve, then we've got the right ventricle, and then up and out through the pulmonary artery. If we look at the left-hand side, so again, orientate it properly. There's the septum. Open up the left ventricle. Here we've got the left atrium. Then we've got here another AV valve, and this one is the bicuspid valve. There's the chordae tendineae. There's the papillary muscle. And if we follow it up and out there, we can see the aorta. Now, if we then dissect it a bit more and try and open up the two main arteries, so I know it's looking a wee bit butchered, but if you look here, so this is the right atrium, here's the AV valve, the tricuspid valve, then we've got the right ventricle, then the blood goes up and out through here, and this is the pulmonary artery. And these little things here, let me see if we can get them, are the semilunar valves. So we'll bring that up nice and close. So that's a little semilunar valve. Now they are very small, but this is why they're called pocket valves. As you can see here, they will sit flat up against the walls of the pulmonary artery. So when the ventricle contracts and forces blood up and out, the blood will push these up against the walls of the pulmonary artery. But when the pressure in the ventricles drops, then to stop blood flowing backwards, these little valves will open like that, and the blood will be prevented from flowing backwards from the artery into the ventricles. So that's the right hand side of the heart. The left hand side then, this is what we can see. So left atrium, bicuspid valve, left ventricle, and then up and out into the aorta. Now, last thing we can compare here is the thickness of the walls of the left and the right ventricles. So if you look at this here is the wall of the right ventricle, and this is the wall of the left ventricle. So there is a real difference between these. Now, as we've talked about before, the right hand side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood through the pulmonary circulation, which is to the lungs. So the walls of the right ventricle need to be thinner because you're only pumping blood a shorter distance, and you want to allow there to be time for gas exchange in the lungs. So by pumping the blood at a lower pressure, the blood can stay in the lungs for longer to become oxygenated. On the left hand side though, we've got much thicker walls because firstly, the blood needs to be pumped a further distance, and second of all, it needs to be able to maintain the blood and tissue fluid balance. So basically, this little muscle here in the walls of the heart have to be able to pump blood the whole way around the body, but also force the plasma out of the blood into the tissues, and then still have enough pressure to be able to force that tissue fluid back into the blood again so that it can recirculate the body. Now, just some other things before we go. So the next wee part we're on to is looking at the coordination of the cardiac cycle. Now, up here we've got the right atrium, here we've got the left atrium. What you'll notice is that there is this layer of fat all around there. Now that's for insulation, but as well as that, this is the layer of non-conductive tissue which separates the atria from the ventricles. And the reason for that is, during the cardiac cycle, we need the atria to contract first to force the blood down into the ventricles, and then we want the ventricles to contract from the bottom up. So this layer of fat is really important, and no matter how skinny and how athletic you are, everybody needs this layer of fat for their heart to function properly. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.